Too sandy for farming, one man called. Too wet for living, said another. My husband Eli kept his eyes ahead and only lifted 2 fingers from the reins in a calm greeting, but I knew that look in his face. His jaw set hard. The line beside his mouth sharpened. That was how he looked when he had decided he would rather break than bend. I sat beside him on the wagon seat with my daughter Ruth tucked close to me and my son Caleb half asleep under a quilt in the back. Ahead lay our new property, a cheap patch of land near a swampy lake in southern Georgia. It was the only land we could afford after years of scraping, saving, and watching better chances pass into other hands. We had money, a few tools, 2 children, and stubborn enough hope to keep moving. From a distance, the place almost looked beautiful. The late sun turned the sandy stretches pale gold. Pine trunks glowed red-brown in the light. The lake shone dark as tea, broken by reeds, lily pads, and rings where fish rose near the surface. Spanish moss hung from the trees like worn lace. White birds stepped through the shallows as if the land belonged only to them. Then Eli climbed down from the wagon and sank nearly to the ankle. Ruth leaned forward. "Mama," she whispered, "is the ground supposed to do that?" "No," I said, "but I think it plans to keep doing it anyway." Eli pulled his boot free with a wet-sucking sound and looked back at me. "Well," he said, "dry as dust, at least nobody can accuse us of buying ordinary land." So that was our beginning. The first week, we slept under canvas stretched between 2 pines while Eli and I started a lean-to from salvaged boards and straight saplings cut nearby. The children gathered kindling, shook bugs from blankets, and slapped mosquitoes with outrage. By morning, our clothes felt damp. By noon, the air thickened until every breath seemed to drag through warm water. The smell of mud and pine lived in everything. Nights brought frog song from the reeds and the far splash of unseen things moving in black water. Still, I held tight to my picture of what the place might become. A small, sturdy house. A porch. Paths that remained firm after rain. Rows of corn, beans, squash, and greens. Jars cooling on shelves. A life that belongs to us and nobody else. That picture lasted until we tried to plant. We chose a patch that looked a little higher than the rest, near a line of scrub pines where the sun fell through most of the day. Eli broke the top layer with a shovel while I followed behind, crumbling the sand apart and pulling out roots. But 1 foot down the pale ground turned black and slick, and when the shovel bit deeper, water sawed into the cut as if the land had been hiding it just below the skin. "Maybe it'll drain," I said, though even to me the words sounded thin. Eli drove the shovel in again. More water gathered in the trench and gleamed there silently. We planted anyway. That Sunday night rain slammed down so hard it beat against the canvas roof like fists. The wind is worried every seam. Caleb crawled into my blanket before dawn. Ruth muttered in her sleep. Eli lay awake beside me, staring into the dark. By morning, the patch was ruined. Our neat rows were gone, washed flat into mud. Seeds had floated off or sunk below. Water stood where our first hope had been. I stared at it until my throat burned. Then I said, "The land has spoken." Eli let out a short breath. "Then we'd better learn its language." From that morning on, we treated the land less like a possession and more like a creature with moods of its own. We watched it at sunrise when the mist lifted off the lake in pale ribbons and every spiderweb in the reeds shone with dew. We watched it at noon when the heat pressed down so hard the air itself seemed to sweat. We watched it after rain when places that looked firm at supper turned to trembling muck by breakfast. I began carrying a little scrap of paper in my apron pocket and marking what I saw. Where the water gathered first. Where it lingered longest. Which places dried fastest after 3 clear days. Eli cut stakes from young pine and drove them into the ground to mark the edges of puddles after every storm. Ruth took to following him with solemn seriousness, adding her own observations as if she were some tiny surveyor sent by the government. "This patch cracks on top, but squishes underfoot," she said one afternoon. "That rise holds ants," she noted the next day. "Maybe it stays drier." Caleb was less exact, but he had a sharp eye for life. He crouched to study frogs, worms, weeds, beetles, and grasses, then came running to report like each discovery might save us. "Something grows here, Mama." There's roots under this one. This grass stays green when the other turns yellow. We listened to all of it. Our first efforts after the failed garden were blooming. Eli and I built mounds of earth, thinking height alone would save the roots. The first hard rain flattened them. We dug channels to pull water off, but the sides caved in and the trenches filled from below almost as fast as they emptied from above. We hauled richer soil from farther inland and mixed it with sand and rotted leaves, only to watch the damp creep upward through everything we laid down. By July, my hands had gone from blistered to raw and then to hard again. The children's shoes were always muddy. Half our boards warped before we could use them. The little house frame rose slowly beside the lake, and some evenings I stood looking at it with a tiredness so deep it felt older than I was. Town offered no comfort. When we went in for meal, nails, lamp oil, or seed, people asked after the place in voices sweet enough to sting. "Are you making that swamp behavior yet? Heard your beans preferred swimming." One man told Eli he would buy the property from us for less than half what we had paid, just to spare us more disappointment. Eli smiled in a way that warned the conversation was over. I kept my face still until we were back on the wagon, then cried quietly all the way home without letting the children see. That night the heat would not break. The air inside the lean-to sat heavy and close, and the frogs by the lake sang so loudly it felt like the darkness itself had a throat. I stepped outside to breathe and found Eli down near the waterline, standing on a patch of narrow boards we had thrown over the mud. He did not turn when I came beside him. "I was thinking," he said, "that can be dangerous." He gave the smallest hint of a laugh. "We keep trying to plant on the ground. Maybe that's the foolish part." I looked out over the reeds, black against the moonlit water. "Do you mean pots?" "Not exactly. Something bigger. Something above the wet." The idea hung between us there, strange and unfinished. The next morning we started testing it with whatever scraps we had. We dragged planks from the wagon bed, split saplings, and lashed together a rough platform between 4 driven posts in one of the least stable patches we owned. It looked ridiculous, like a dock for a boat too foolish to find water. I wove willow switches through the sides of a shallow frame while Ruth handed me links and Caleb stomped mud off the hammer. Then we filled that crooked box with the driest mix we could make from hulled soil, leaf mold, sand, and manure. It was not yet a plan, only a question built out of scraps and mead. At last, the land answered. At first, I did not trust it. That raised box looked frail makeshift, too much like the kind of thing people build when they are out of proper options. The woven sides bowed from the weight of the soil. The posts leaned just enough to make me nervous. The whole bed stood above the muck on supports, looking less like a garden and more like a crate in the swamp. Still, we planted. Not much. We could not afford to waste seed on an idea that might fail by the week's end. I pressed in a few bean seeds, some grains, and 6 corn kernels with such care you would have thought they were coins of gold. Caleb asked if plants liked being off the ground. Ruth asked whether roots got lonely hanging above all that wet earth. Eli said roots did not care about pride, only conditions. Then came the waiting. Every morning I walked out before breakfast to inspect the bed. I expected rot, sagging boards, washed out soil, or some new humiliation from the land. Instead, the surface remained loose and crumbly. It did not turn slick or sour beneath my fingers. Even after 2 heavy rains, the water drained through instead of sitting. The platform darkened and swelled a little, but it held. One pale morning, as the mist lifted from the lake, I saw the first green hook of a bean seedling. I called the children so fast they came running barefoot. Ruth dropped to her knees beside the bed. "Is that one?" "That's one," I said. Caleb grinned. "It didn't drown." "No," Eli said quietly behind us. It didn't. Over the next days, more seedlings appeared. Thin at first, then stronger each morning. The greens rose quickest. The beans followed. Even the corn came, straight and stubborn. I kept waiting for disaster, for the stems to yellow, for fungus to creep in. But the bed kept doing what our ground plots never had. It's breathed. The roots were held above the soaked earth, and the soil remained light enough that air could move through. For the first time since coming to Georgia, I felt hope that did not need pretending. That hope made workers of all of us. Once Eli saw the seedlings taking hold, he wasted no time. We built a second bed, then a third. The next ones were stronger, with thicker corner posts and better braces. I wove tighter walls from willow and cane. Ruth sorted twigs by length and handed them over. Caleb carried leaf mold in a bucket, so large it bumped his legs as he walked. We made the beds wider, then longer, then set them in lines where the morning light reached and the worst standing water remained below. We learned as we went. Too much sand in the mix and it dried too fast. Too much manure and the seedlings burned. Boards laid flat beside the bed sank, so Eli raised narrow walkways on runners and pegged them down. We found that the best soil came from hauled dirt, rotted leaves, swamp edge muck left to sweeten in a pile, and ash from our cook fire. By late summer, the property had begun to change. What had looked like a useless patch of wet sand was now crossed by rough paths. Raised beds stood above the damp like islands of order. The house walls were half planked. In the evenings, when the lowering sun struck the leaves in those beds, the green looked almost unreal against all that dark water and pale sand. At first, they only slowed when passing. Then they stared openly. One afternoon, a man who had laughed at us in spring stopped by the road and took off his hat, squinting toward the beds. Well, he called, I'll be damned. I was too pleased to pretend modesty. You may be, I called back, but my beans are not. Eli turned away so the man would not see him smile. That evening, as frogs sang from the reeds and the heat loosened its grip, I stood on our walkway and looked over the raised rows, the house, and the children chasing fireflies. The land had not changed its nature. It was still wet, still difficult, but we had stopped asking it to become something else. At last, we were learning how to live the way it was allowed. Success, once it showed itself, did not arrive all at once as some grand transformation. It came in useful pieces. A bed that held through a storm. A row of beans that climbed instead of blackened. Greens we could cut twice instead of once. Corn that stood straight through a week of damp heat while other patches in the county turned yellow, then limp, then foul at the roots. I had imagined that if victory ever came, it would feel like shouting. Instead, it felt like work that finally answered back. We kept building. Every spare board became part of a walkway, a brace, a platform, or a frame. Eli began choosing wood not just for strength, but for where it would sit longest above water. He sharpened posts and drove them deeper. He learned which pine resisted rot best and which saplings bent clean for weaving. I saved every scrap of cloth to tie bundles, every bucket of ash from the cook fire, every peel and rind and spoiled leaf for the compost heap. Even the children moved through the place with purpose now. Ruth could weave a side wall nearly as tight as mine, and Caleb had become expert at spotting weak places where a plank might tilt or a bed might settle crooked after rain. By autumn, the property looked less like a failed camp and more like a homestead built according to a logic only we understood. Narrow raised paths crossed the wettest sections. Beds stood in grouped rows, some for beans and greens, some for squash, and some for the late corn that was surprised even Eli with its strength. Near the house, we set the newest beds a little lower where the ground was firmer, and farther out near the swamp edge, we raised them high on stout supports. We stopped fighting the differences in the land and used them instead. The house rose with the garden. First came a proper floor, blessedly dry underfoot. Then the walls are tight enough to keep most of the insects honest. Then shutters, a roof that did not shudder in every rain, and a little porch where I could sit in the evening with aching hands and still feel grateful. The first time I hung herbs to dry inside our own wall instead of from the tent rope, I nearly cried from the simple pleasure of it. The neighbors noticed all of it. Curiosity changed their faces before kindness did. They slowed down their wagons. They found reasons to pass by. Some stopped and asked careful questions in tones that tried to forget the old laughter. One woman came under pretense of returning a bowl and spent half an hour staring at the supports beneath the bean beds. Another man squatted by our walkway, rapped the planks with his knuckles, and said, "Thought this place would swallow you." Eli answered, "It tried." Not everyone softened. A few still shook their heads as though our success insulted them personally. But mockery loses force when spoken beside living proof. The rows were there. The harvest was there. The house was there. A thing built plainly enough can argue for itself. Then came the long, wet heat the following year, worse than anything we had seen since buying the place. Rain fell when it should not have. Air hung heavy for days. In town, people spoke with dread about mildew, rot, worms, and roots drowning in fields that could not breathe. We knew that fear. We had lived inside it. But our bed stood above the worst of the water, and though we lost some plants, we lost far fewer than most. For the first time, people stopped coming to laugh and started coming to learn. One evening, before dusk, I looked out across the place and saw neighbors standing at the fence with hats in their hands, waiting not to judge but to ask. That sight moved through me deeper than pride. It meant we had outlasted the story others told about us. We were no longer the foolish family on worthless land. We were the ones who had made something grow where nobody expected it. And in that twilight, with frogs calling and the boards warm under my feet, I understood that survival had turned into authority at last.